The most interesting college football storyline since the beginning of the 2021 season, post-COVID, and really the start of the name, image, and likeness and transfer portal era has been the game. It's been Michigan versus Ohio State, and the transition from that rivalry being thought of as dead by some and even a freebie for Ohio State football into now Michigan controlling the rivalry, and how is Ohio State responding to that? And it's been interesting watching Ohio State's response and then watching college football analysts and the general public's response to Ohio State's response to that adversity. It's fascinating. I mean, the game has been the most watched regular season game for 3 years in a row. And even if you factor in the playoff games, bowl games, national championship games, it's still up there. And I can't remember exactly, but I think that even last year it was the most watched game of the season. I know in 2022, Georgia versus Ohio State in the Peach Bowl actually garnered more viewership, as it should have been. It was a game that went down to the final few seconds, and that essentially was the national championship game that season. And that actually relates to what I'm going to be talking about today, because Ohio State as a program is still up at the top. They're still an elite program. And they have a head coach who I respect, who I think everyone should respect, who I think is elite or on the precipice of being an elite coach. And I can say that. And I can say that Ohio State this year is going to be a really good team. They have the right to be favored to win the Big Ten based off of returning production, returning starters, recruiting, portal additions, staff changes. I can say all those things. And yet at the same time, I can say that this team should be better. There are more changes that I think have to be made. And there are questions I have. And also at the same time, I can say that I think that a lot of national media people, and even some Ohio State fans and Michigan fans, don't have the correct perspective on Ohio State. And maybe I don't either, but at least at this current moment, I think that I have a perspective that's very close to the correct one. So we are going to be diving into a pool of scarlet and gray today. But before we do so, before we go headfirst into the pool, hopefully I don't break my neck, I want to remind you to please hit that like button. Liking my videos, any videos on YouTube, really helps said channel get into the algorithm so they can grow, get more subscribers, also earn more income. So just that simple clicking the like button means a lot, and I would appreciate it if you did that. Also, subscribe to the channel, please, and click the notification bell so that you can get notified when I release more college football content as it relates to Ohio State, the Big Ten, or college football at large. Within the next week, there will be a new Big Ten predictions video dropping, along with probably a new college football playoff predictions video, both of which Ohio State's going to be a big focus in, as they're obviously in the top tier of the Big Ten, and I think the top tier of the country right now as well. Hit the notification bell as well so you can get notified when I release that content. It'll appear on your screen. You have easy access to get to said video that I release. And comment your thoughts on Ohio State down below and the thoughts that I express and share in this video. Lastly, if you want to support the channel, you can check out my Patreon page or my merchandise store. The links are both in the video description and in the pinned comment at the top of the comment section. Thank you all so much for listening to that brief message of mine. Let's talk Buckeye football. I have a few questions as it relates to Ohio State football's 2024 season, and you all are probably thinking, correctly, that I'm going to talk about the quarterback position and the offensive line. But I also want to go deeper than that. Feel free to answer any of these questions that I pose down in the comment section, as I would love to have productive dialogue with you. First and foremost, can Will Howard have sustainable accuracy? Second, will the offensive line be developed beyond their star talent? And third, this one is more broad, but I still think it's a big question. How much physical exhaustion will this team face? Or perhaps it would be better to phrase that question this way. How much physical exhaustion can this team take? After all, for the previous, I would say, 4 seasons, going to the beginning of the COVID year, this team has had one side of the football that is not known for its toughness, or is undisciplined, or is shaky. Not just a weak link in the team in the sense that it's the weakest position of the team, but a weak position, period, relative to their talent or the expectations that Ohio State football has put upon themselves. After all, they are the most consistent program since World War II. And they're very successful. They are a blue blood. And right now, again, I consider them to be an elite program, one of the best in the country, and they have one of the best head coaches in the country. But I still have questions. Part of that is because this year of college football is a down year, and Ohio State over the previous 3 seasons has not exactly lived up to their expectations or potential. But more on that in a little bit, more of the long-term view, both in the past and the future. These are the here and now questions. Will Howard, his strength is his gutsiness, it's his ability to scramble, it's the fact that he's 6'5", 242. Joe Milton is 6'5", 235. Big frame, ideal frame for a quarterback. And they both do have a level of explosiveness and arm strength and gutsiness to them. Will Howard, however, similar to Joe Milton, but I think much better than Joe Milton in the accuracy and turnover area, still has issues with accuracy and turning over the football. Last season, he had 24 passing touchdowns, 10 interceptions, 2,643 passing yards, and a 75.1 quarterback efficiency rating. He had 351 rushing yards with 9 rushing touchdowns. Again, top 25, top 30 quarterback by efficiency, and he had a 140.1 passer rating, again at Kansas State. He is going to have much better receivers, much better running backs, and more resources, and also a far better defense compared to what he had at Kansas State. But the offensive line, that's an area that may actually regress, but we're talking about quarterback here. In his career, Howard has completed less than 60% of his career passing attempts, and he has a touchdown to interception ratio that is slightly below 2-1. So he has issues turning over the football. In fact, in 2020, he also threw 10 interceptions. He threw 4 in 2022 when he had limited starts. He came in to replace Adrian Martinez and was better than Adrian Martinez, and he barely saw any action in 2021. He's a veteran. He has seniority. Again, the ideal build for a quarterback. He can run, and he has potential in the passing game. I mean, there are times where he's throwing bullets. He's throwing darts. He can be very accurate. He can also make some out of this world, in the bad sense, throws. He can be inaccurate. He can lose a game for you, I think. Against Oklahoma State last season, he threw 3 interceptions. That was a game where Kansas State lost by 8. Now against Texas and against Missouri, 2 teams that finished inside of the top 10, he had a combined TD to INT ratio of 7-2. And against Iowa State, where the Wildcats lost in a crazy game, Kansas State had 45 minutes of TOP, and yet they still lost by a touchdown because Iowa State, I think, averaged well over 10 yards per play. He completed just 50% of his throws, a touchdown, a pick, a 103 passer rating. Now, Iowa State's known for their good defenses, and against other teams like, let's say, Baylor, Houston, TCU, and Southeastern Missouri, FCS school, he just lit those defenses on fire. But you see the point that I'm making. Whether it's Oklahoma State, whose defense and secondary were awful, and he performed horribly, or against Mizzou, who had a respectable secondary and Howard did well, or Texas, where by QBR he didn't do too well, but by passer rating and just the fact that he helped keep his team in that game. And the coaching staff didn't exactly help them, going for it on 4th and goal from the 4 in overtime. Should have kicked the field goal there. Expected points added would have told you to do that. But Colin Klein and Chris Kleiman didn't listen to that. and that allowed Texas to get into the college football playoff. Where, yeah, we all know what happened with Washington. But anyway, I don't want to get too off track. The point is, Howard has a high ceiling. It's not an elite ceiling, I don't think. I don't think he can be a Joe Burrow, a J.J. McCarthy, a Tua Tagovailoa, certainly not a Bryce Young, a C.J. Stroud, not even close to a C.J. Stroud. And all those players that I mentioned aren't necessarily in the same category in college either. Like, Stroud is certainly ahead of McCarthy. Same with Tua Tagovailoa and Joe Burrow. But even a J.J. McCarthy level QB or Bo Nix, and maybe even someone like Michael Penix Jr., just looking at the systems that those QBs were in, plus their talent, I don't know if Howard can even be that good for any of those QBs that I brought up. But he can be great. The question is, what does his average level of play look like? And he needs to be accurate. He cannot turn over the ball. And while his rushing ability certainly will help this team, especially with Chip Kelly's spread option system, I don't know if he will be able to sustain accuracy. And while Kyle McCord last year was not a Stroud, he was not a Justin Fields, Ohio State needed better, I don't know if Howard's an upgrade in the passing department. He could seriously be a downgrade. That's not unrealistic to pose at all. In fact, that may be more likely than not, just based off of what we have seen from the two quarterbacks in the passing game department. Let's touch on the second question, the offensive line. Ohio State out-recruits Michigan every single year. It's about the only given area right now where you know Ohio State will be better than Michigan in, outside of course, wide receivers. That's it. And that is to Ohio State's credit. That's part of the reason why they're picked to do much better than Michigan this year, even though Michigan has beaten them 3 times and is the 3-time reigning Big Ten champions. It's not just Michigan losing their staff or much of their production. Ohio State recruits better. But when you zone in on the position of the offensive line, Michigan not only outdevelops Ohio State, they out-recruit Ohio State on the offensive line. In the 2024 recruiting class, where Ohio State had a great recruiting class, like they always do. It's something that I love about Ohio State is how well they recruit. On the offensive line, their highest rated player was Ian Moore, who was barely a top 200 interior offensive lineman. Now that's a good signing, good pickup. Next, you have to go down to Devontae Armstrong, 3-star offensive tackle, and Deontay Armstrong, another 3-star offensive tackle. And that is for this class. That's for the 2024 recruiting class. Those were the enrollees. You look at signed letters of intent, players who haven't enrolled yet, you have Gabe Van Sickle, 3-star interior offensive lineman. Michigan recruited better than that on the offensive line for the 2024 cycle. They did. They didn't recruit better at any other position, even at quarterback, despite the fact that Jaden Davis at one point was rated ahead of Aaron Noland. They got Blake Frazier, who 4-star, just barely outside the top 200 at offensive tackle. They had Jake Garnera, interior offensive lineman, 3-star. But then they got top 100 offensive tackle Andrew Sprague, and also Luke Hamilton, 4-star offensive tackle out of Ohio, and Ben Roebuck, 3-star offensive tackle out of Ohio. They out-recruited Ohio State just by not only volume, but average player ranking at the offensive line position. And Michigan, as of now, develops way better. I'm, of course, making that comparison because Michigan's been the only team that's been able to beat Ryan Day in the Big Ten. Literally no one else can do it. And the offensive line's been a big part of the reason why. Now, they return Donovan Jackson. They return Carson Hinsman. They bring in the Alabama center, who mightily struggled at snapping the football. His name's escaping me, but luckily, Seth McLaughlin, his name is right up here on my screen. That's why you take notes, people. And also, Josh Simmons and Josh Fryer return, the 2 offensive tackles. But returning production, while good, isn't always a guarantee, especially when you're not good at developing X position. And Ohio State in 21 and 22 had great offensive lines. Last year's struggles at tackle were expected, but the struggle at guard, where Matthew Jones and Donovan Jackson returned after the 21 and 2022 units were excellent at running the football, even at times up the middle, that was kind of a shocker to me. And maybe it shouldn't have been, but that unit struggled as well. And with the way that Ohio State has been recruiting at the O-line position, not bringing in a ton of volume, not a ton of high-level, high-caliber players either, and they've been losing some of those players to the portal, I question the depth, I question the ceiling. I think that's understandable. I don't think that's unfair. I'm not questioning the defense, the receiver core, certainly not the running back room. I'm not even questioning tight end, where I think there's underrated depth there in Merrick and Thurman. And also, don't forget Scott Jr. as well. And there could be questions at tight end, but I want to focus on the O-line. The recruiting and the development has regressed over the previous 3 seasons. It's not getting better. And that's why Justin Fry was brought in. So this is a big season for him specifically as an assistant, as a position coach. And finally, how much physical exhaustion can this team face? How much will they face even? Because depending on how they do in the regular season or how they do in the playoff, this team may or may not have to play 16, 17 games, maybe less, but if they play less, they're not playing for a national title, and that would be a disappointment to many Ohio State fans and many who are high on the Buckeyes. How much can this team even take? If they have to play Michigan twice, if Penn State's more physical this year, they have to play Oregon, maybe they have to play Oregon twice, and then they have to play Georgia. Maybe a team like Utah in the playoff. Maybe they play Alabama. Maybe they play Oregon or Michigan 3 times. They play them regular season, Indy, and playoff. Will this team be able to beat all those teams? They can suffer a loss in the regular season or in Indy, but that's about it. Maybe they could suffer 2 losses in the regular season, one of them being in Indy, or just go 10-2 and miss the Big Ten title completely, but still make the playoff. At that point, though, you're playing with fire, especially adding the extra game and having to travel on the road in the first round. How much can this team take? Can they rebound, and can they counterpunch, and can they take several games over against teams who are known to be physical, like Georgia, Oregon, Michigan, Kalen DeBoer at Washington? People will overlook this. His teams at Washington were as physical as they can be. They just didn't express it in a way that many would expect. They expressed it through the air and through being disciplined and through having great pass protection and still running when they can, still trying to keep defenses honest. They didn't express it the way Michigan did, or Michigan just pounded everyone with the ground game, with Corum, Edwards, and Haskins. But DeBoer's Alabama, I think, will be physical. And what about Texas? Texas has a great offensive line, and their defensive line may be better than I expect it to be. So there's so many teams that may or may not be elite in the physicality department. And I know for a fact Georgia will be. I'm pretty sure Oregon will be, even with some of their struggles against Washington last year. And I'm very confident that Michigan will be physical as well. So those are just some questions that I have, and I wanted to spend a lot of time on those 3 because they're big. If all of these questions go against Ohio State, this team's not winning at all. In fact, they're not even probably reaching the Final Four or the national championship game if all these questions are answered negatively. But if all of them are answered possibly, I will tell you, this team will probably be better than even Georgia. And I'm very high on Georgia this year, as are analytics and as are many people, for all the right reasons. We'll get back to talking about Ohio State entering this season at the end of the video, I promise. But what I want to go into now is talking about my perspective and view on Ohio State, what I think they could do to be better, what I think they're doing right, and some areas of uncertainty that I have, and try and provide some data as well to back up some of my thoughts. And again, I'm just a student at the University of Michigan who loves college football, who has a strong admiration and affinity for Ohio State despite being a Michigan fan. I'm not a head coach. I'm not a football player. You can say that I don't know what I'm talking about, and you may be right. In fact, that's the case with many of these analysts at times. Wrong predictions are a part of doing this job. So give me all the criticism that you want. I'll take it. And if I'm wrong, I will admit that I'm wrong. Just look at how many times I mention that awful 2022 Nebraska prediction that I made. I can't believe I bought into Scott Frost, but who cares? Here are some myths or some statements that I have heard about Ohio State that I question, and whether it relates to this season or the Ryan Day tenure or the future of the program, I just want to talk about them here. First and foremost, I want to start with this one. The Urban Meyer teams were better. I hear this a lot. I hear people say that they would like Urban Meyer back. Not necessarily as this ultra serious comment. Urban hasn't been coaching in college football for more than half a decade, and I don't know if his style would translate to this new era of college football. Day is, and this is not an insult. This isn't even relating to team toughness. Day seems like an easier going guy. Like, the passion is the same. And the obsession and the attention to detail, I think, is still very good. And I think he learned a lot of that, or at least those skills that he has were in part honed by Urban. By softer, I mean in the sense that Urban Meyer objectively is a jerk. I don't think Ryan Day objectively is a jerk. You don't have to be a jerk to be a winning elite head coach. And by jerk, I mean being a jerk to be a jerk. Not like Nick Saban, who's yelling at his players, but doing it because he wants them to be better, and he wants them to be the best that he can be, and he's trying to reach them. And if you disagree with that fact about Urban Meyer, I'd encourage you to look at his tenure with the Jacksonville Jaguars. But that's beside the point. His teams were not better. They weren't. This is false. Now, they were better in some other areas, some specific skill sets or abilities. One of them being beating Michigan, or I'd say performance relative to their ceiling in top games. But look at S&P Plus. You can also look at ESPN's FPI. Look at the average ranking of Ohio State across the Urban Meyer tenure versus the Ryan Day tenure. In both FPI and S&P Plus, which are mostly year to year, I think S&P Plus, it's easier to track and compare the different seasons. FPI, not so much, but that's a novice opinion of mine that I don't have much facts to back up. But you look at Ohio State's SP Plus rankings, their average S&P Plus ranking in the tenure of Ryan Day has been nearly a 30. And any team that's 30 overall or better in the S&P Plus typically wins or competes for a national championship. That's a national championship caliber team. And that's been Day's average team every year. Urban's average team every season was about a 26 in SP Plus. Now, again, I don't know if this is exactly the correct interpretation, but I used S&P Plus instead of FPI because I know for a fact FPI is only meant to compare teams year to year. Now, if there's a big change between, let's say, Alabama in 2020, who was a GOAT team, and Michigan in 2019, who was an above-average team, you could easily, use FPI to say, hey, Alabama was much better and more dominant. But when it comes to comparing teams of similar rank, I don't exactly know. But S&P Plus is about tempo. It's especially about dominance. And the Urban Meyer teams, again, only being a 26 versus Day's 29, the fact that Urban Meyer didn't play elite teams in Michigan, for example, 2022 Michigan and 2023 Michigan, were tougher opponents than any opponent Urban Meyer faced in the regular season, and that's just a fact. What team did Urban face in the regular season that was 13-1 or 15-0 at the end of the season and was as good as 2022 or 2023 Michigan? There weren't any. 2013 Michigan State may have been close, and that team kicked Ohio State's butt that year in 2013. And we could go on and on and on. You zoom in on 2023 and 2021. That's 2 years after Day was hired as the full-time head coach. At that point, all the players on his roster, or most of them, were recruited or enrolled when Day was at least on Urban's staff. And there are some players even that Day exclusively recruited who are now starting. Some younger players like Jackson Smith and Jigba, for example, was just awesome in college and unfortunately got injured in 2022. If he stayed healthy that year, Ohio State goes either 13-1 or 15-0 and has a national championship either way. It just depends on whether they lose to Michigan or not. You zoom in on those 3 seasons, Ohio State still on average is 29 in S&P Plus, just 1 point lower when you don't factor in the 2020 and 2019 teams. Ryan Day's teams are dominant. They're great at controlling games. And again, they don't lose to anyone in the Big Ten but Michigan. And when you look nationally, 3 of their 8 losses are to national champions. 3. 2020 Bama, 2022 Georgia, 2023 Michigan. And you include 2019 Clemson for teams that appeared in the national championship game. That's 4. Half of his losses, Days, were to teams that appeared in the national championship game. That's absolutely nuts. There's no loss to Purdue. There's no loss to Iowa. There's no loss to a James Franklin team. There's no loss to Virginia Tech. Now, there's no national title. I get that. And I do agree that Urban Meyer's teams in the big moments did come through more. But I think that the quote just overall that the Urban Meyer teams were better, I do think that is a stretch to a certain degree. And I think that the data backs that up. The superior offenses, last year's defense, think of this, a Ryan Day defense, last year's defense was better than any defense Urban Meyer ever had, statistically. And they played Missouri, and they played Michigan. They didn't play too much of anyone else who had an awesome offense, but Michigan's offense and Missouri's offenses were near elite, had an elite capacity. And those defenses played very well against those offenses. And we don't even need to talk about Ryan Day's resume on offense compared to Urban's. I mean, that's the reason Urban Meyer, toward the end of his career at Ohio State, had a good offense, was because of Ryan Day. And to continue this, quote, the Urban teams were tougher. There's actually some truth to this, but you have to look at Urban Meyer and who his teams played. And toward the end of his time at Ohio State in 16, 17, and 18, his teams lost their edge. They lost a big game to Clemson, ended up losing a big game to Penn State. Didn't look big at the time, but it helped Penn State win the Big Ten championship game. They lost to Oklahoma at home. That Iowa game wasn't a big game. Actually, it was, because if they won that game, that Ohio State team probably would have been in the college football playoff over Alabama. And therefore, the national champion for that season is different, if not for that blowout loss to Iowa on the road. In 2018, that Purdue game kept them out of the college football playoff. Toughness in big games, I don't know. I think there is some truth to the fact that Urban Meyer teams were better coached and they had that dog mentality in those big games. But also Michigan teams that faced Urban Meyer, again using SP+, were far inferior. The average Michigan team that Urban Meyer played was 9 points worse in SP+ than the average team that Urban Meyer coached at Ohio State. Then you look at modern Ohio State versus Michigan, the game as it stands today, and you take out 2020 because Michigan was terrible. You take out 2019 because that's Day's first year. Even if you factor in those years, Michigan gains 3 points on Ohio State on average. You take the past 3 seasons, Michigan's ahead by about half a point. It's not that Ohio State's gotten worse under Urban Meyer. Statistically, it's that Michigan is caught up. It's that Michigan now from a power rankings angle, has achieved what Ohio State has. Where yearly, you are a national champion or at least college football playoff Final Four contender, where you have that ability to win it all. Now, if it's 1%, 5%, 25%, or even as dominant as 50%, you have that chance. No Michigan team under Jim Harbaugh before the 2021 team had a chance at winning it all. None. 2016, Michigan was talented, but they lost to Ohio State, they lost to Iowa, and that Iowa team got blanked by Florida in their bowl game, and that Ohio State team got blanked by Clemson. That year was Clemson or Alabama. In 2021, it was Georgia, or maybe Alabama, or maybe Ohio State if they don't lose to Oregon, or if they somehow beat Michigan, which was unlikely. In 22 and 23, though, those Michigan teams, in 2023, Michigan won it all. 2022, Michigan very much could have won it all. And Ohio State, every year under Ryan Day, definitely had the ceiling to win it all. And I would call performances against Georgia in that Peach Bowl tough. I would say last year's game against Michigan was a tough performance by Ohio State. They showed some physicality. The final one of this part one is Ryan Day is overrated. My question to that is relative to what? Kind of pulling a Josh Pate there when he answers questions about James Franklin being overrated. But seriously, relative to what? Who was Ryan Day rated over that he shouldn't be? He's better than Dabo Swinney. I don't care that Swinney has 2 national titles. He has He stunk the past 3-4 seasons. His teams have stunk. And he has too. He's actively drilling into their forehead. He's killing Clemson right now. He's burying them. He's better than Sharon Moore. I wouldn't say he's better than Jim Harbaugh, but Jim Harbaugh's no longer in college. Same story with Nick Saban. The only coach that you can compare to Ryan Day, who you can have ahead of him, for sure, is Kirby Smart. That's it. And maybe I would hear an argument about Kalen DeBoer. If you want to specifically zone in on game management and achievement relative to recruiting or resources, which I love to do, I'd hear Kyle Whittingham over Ryan Day. Maybe I'd even hear Jonathan Smith. But that's just a handful of coaches. He's definitely a top 10 head coach, and I would say he's definitely top 5 because Smith, Whittingham, and DeBoer are all very debatable, and many people, understandably so, have Day ahead of all 3 of those coaches. I have him ahead of definitely one of those coaches, maybe 2. Heck, by the end of the season, he could definitely be the best head coach in the country if he wins it all, if he beats Georgia. Even if you zone in on Day's specific skills, even the ones where he's had shortcomings, he's at minimum great at everything. Game management. The only games where his game management has been questionable are outside of the games against the top 5 teams, and I'd even argue you can't count 2020 Alabama against him. That team was so no one was beating that team. No one was beating that Alabama team. I don't care who you line up against them, unless you pull out Miami or Nebraska teams from like a decade or 2 decades before that team, or maybe 2019 LSU or 2019 Ohio State. No one in 2020 was beating that Nick Saban team. I'm not holding that loss against Day. I don't think you should either. Game management. He's beaten every team that he should. And against Penn State, against Clemson in 2020, and even against Michigan last year, I think he did a good job at managing games. Good isn't good enough at Ohio State. It's not. Good might as well be bad. But relative to national expectations, relative to averages, he's at minimum great at everything. The question is he elite at everything? And he's not. No one is. Which is why Ohio State fans are thankful, and should be thankful, that he's taking more of a CEO role this upcoming season. Part 2 of this that I want to talk about, and these will be shorter, because I think the previous 3 were more important, at least in my opinion, or more interesting to talk about. Number 4, Ohio State needs to run the ball more. I think that one's pretty bad. I don't think they need to copycat Michigan's offense. I think that would be a grave mistake, looking at their O-line recruiting, looking at their O-line development. No. I understand Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins are the perfect combination, just how they're built and their play style. I get that. And I get that the spread option is coming to Ohio State, and having an elite O-line isn't as important with all of that motion and all the options that you have. But still, the O-line is a huge question mark. And to be run heavy with the receivers that you have and with what we should assume is going to be the growth Will Howard will experience in this system, or at least what he could experience, you got to utilize those receivers. And I think a mistake of Ohio State over the past 2 seasons has been their attempt to express their physicality and express their toughness in running the ball, in mimicking Michigan offensively. I think that's part of the reason why, even though Ohio State played closer to their ceiling last year in the game than Michigan did, that Michigan still won. Because Ohio State was trying to play Michigan's game. Remember that drive where Ohio State went run, 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 several more rushing attempts. Like, they ran the ball down Michigan's throat and actually scored. They would have never done that the prior year, the year before that, in 2020 either, unless it was against Northwestern with Trey Sermon. And maybe they would have done it in 2019 rather, with J.K. Dobbins. It's the only other year I could say a Ryan Day team would have done that against a big-time opponent. Just ran the ball that many times. And even in 2019, I don't know if they would have went on a drive like that against the number 1 defense in the country. But they did in 2023, and it succeeded. But it wasn't sustainable. Not one bit. They couldn't run the ball really outside of that drive. Whether it was Henderson, Trainum did a good job, but they didn't use him enough, in my opinion, and even he wasn't perfect. Michigan, meanwhile, they mixed in passes, but they were able to run more consistently and be the better running threat because that's their game. That's their identity. That's what they're built for. Even beyond their identity, that's what they're built for. Even if running the ball is Ohio State's identity, or Day wants to make it Ohio State's identity, if they're not built for it, that's a grave mistake. And the running back room, year after year after year, has been stacked. It has. Injuries have taken it apart the previous 2 seasons. Maybe you could say the same with the offensive line play last year. Maybe there's even some truth in what was rumored about Tony Alford, that he just wasn't doing a good job. Maybe it was that last year as well. Regardless, the offensive line is more important than your running backs when it comes to running the ball. It just is. Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins are better than Blake Corum and Hassan Haskins were in 2021. But despite that, they may have a far worse performance in the ground game if Ohio State's offensive line is once again just average or maybe even below average in run blocking, while Michigan's O-line in 2021 was near elite in run blocking. The only teams who could stop their rushing attack in 2021 were Michigan State and Georgia, who had top 10 defensive lines in the country. So if they're built for it, if they can do it, then yeah, run the ball more because you want to be balanced. You want to have that extra option to attack. The more diverse your offense can be, as long as you're not sacrificing opportunities to score, the better. You want to score as much as possible. Well, but you want to do it while keeping the defense honest. You don't want to be doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. You don't. So the more diversity, as long as it doesn't sacrifice performance or efficiency, is perfect. I just don't know if Ohio State can do that on the ground. So just blanketly saying their offense needs to learn a thing or two from Michigan's, well, yeah, it does, but on the offensive line, in terms of physicality, that's what they need to learn from Michigan's offense, not just running the ball more for the sake of running the ball more. Let me pull up some statistics for you. Ohio State's offenses since 2021 have regressed every year in yards per carry, from 5.6 in 21 to 5.4 in 2022 to 4.2 in 2023. Their sack percentage every season has gotten worse in national rankings, though in terms of actual percent, which matters more, it got better from 21 to 22. Went from 3.3% in 2021, 2.8% in 2022. That 2022 O-line was really good. It was a damn good O-line. In 2023, a 5.4 sack percentage, outside the top 50 in America. And they ran the ball 45% of the time in 2021, 52% of the time in 2022, 51% of the time in 2023. And they were first in the country in efficiency in 21 and 22, and they were first in points per game in 2021, second in points per game for 2022. They were outside of the top 10 in both categories in 2023, outside the top 10. And they were actually outside the top 30 in points per game. So there's been clear regression on offense basically every season, although I don't know about 2022. 2022's O-line, I thought, faced better defenses than 2021's O-line did, and they suffered injuries. But clearly, the 2023 offense was far worse than any offense under Day. And while the 2022 offense might have been better than the 21 offense, I thought it was more poorly managed. Given all that they returned at QB, O-line, receiver, running back, etc., they should have had like a 2019 LSU type offense. But injuries, and I think Ryan Day letting some things get to his head, I think held that offense back in certain moments. Speaking of which, this is another one that I hear that sometimes frustrates me. Ohio State needs to hyper-focus on Michigan. Well, yes, they do. But they need to be careful to not only focus on beating the Wolverines, because if they do that, if Michigan becomes their only obsession, they should be obsessed about beating Michigan, but if they become their only obsession, the way to beat Michigan, the way to match up perfectly against Michigan, does not guarantee you the best chance of winning it all. It doesn't. It just doesn't. Because the way to beat Michigan is to play their game, but better. And while their game is very important to winning it all, Ohio State recruits better than Michigan. Ohio State has receivers that Michigan will probably never have. And trying to play Michigan's game of focusing, I don't know if I'm making sense. And this one's tough because they could learn things from Michigan, but they also can't be too much like them because then they're not going to play to their ceiling. The 2021 offense, the 2022 offense was phenomenal. That did not need to change one bit. What needed to change was the defense, and Day changed the defense, but I think he's changed the offense as well. And by change the offense, I don't mean like bringing in Chip Kelly. I think that's necessary. I mean changing the scheme, changing the identity. C.J. Stroud and his receivers were not the problem in 21 and 22. They weren't. The problem was the defense. The problem was the game management, the play calling. It wasn't the way the offense was built, or at least built to function. I don't think that was the problem. I think with better management and a better defense, 2022 Ohio State's offense maybe lights Michigan up like a firecracker. Maybe. With last year's defense, with 2022 Ohio State's offense, that team in 22 or 23 wins it all and probably beats Michigan handily in 2022 and beats them in a close game, the inverse of last year's result for Ohio State in Ann Arbor. I think it's just that simple. But then again, nothing is ever that simple. I just think that Ohio State, while they need to beat Michigan, and that needs to be a goal of theirs, we know that it is. They need to prioritize winning the national title and playing to their potential and looking at everything with an open mind and seeing all their options. Because if they're only focused on beating Michigan and they get that tunnel vision, their performance against other teams like we saw last year might suffer. Their ceiling might be lowered. Their ability to win it all may be gone if they get too tunnel visioned. So that's just a cautionary opinion of mine. And finally, this is the year. We're going to get into this in like a few seconds. Maybe it is, but Ohio State has issues to resolve, and the Michigan losses were far from flukes. They were not flukes. I will tell you that much. Make no mistake about it. Ohio State's losses to Michigan are not due to solely poor coaching or solely poor roster management. It's not just those things. Those things are a part of it. They are. But Michigan has also rapidly improved over the previous 3 seasons. And it's not just team by team. It's the system. It's the culture. It's what Michigan still has right now, even as Harbaugh and most of his staff are gone. It's the identity and the program that's been built there. Even if Sharon Moore isn't the guy to lead Michigan, there's a great chance that the system is so solid and so good and so concrete that it takes a year or two for Michigan to truly be an above-average mediocre team and not a good, great, near elite team. The Big Ten, this isn't just Michigan, it mostly is, but it's also conference realignment and Penn State not going away after they struggled in 20 and 2021. The Big Ten has been catching up to the SEC at the top. They're still not at the SEC. The SEC is much deeper, I think this year especially. But in adding Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA, Michigan stepping up to the plate, and Penn State still existing, and I'd say being a great to near elite program, they're adding depth, and they're adding quality programs at the top. They're closer to the SEC than they were in 2018, 2017, 2019, especially 2020, where you had Georgia, A&M, Florida, Alabama, and in the Big Ten, you just had Ohio State, and that was about it. Like Northwestern and Iowa had good years, but they were never going to compete with even the fourth or fifth best SEC team, most likely. The Big Ten's been catching up overall to the SEC, and these are mostly teams not named Ohio State, which makes it tougher on Ohio State. Again, as I mentioned earlier, per S&P Plus, Michigan and Ohio State are rated about the same over the past 3 seasons. Power rated about the same. The only teams since the beginning of the college football playoff era with a higher rank over any 3 years are Georgia and Alabama. Georgia, Alabama, Michigan, Ohio State. By results on the field and by power rankings and by the eye test, but most importantly, results on the field, those are the most impressive 3 programs over the past, or 4 programs rather, over the past 3 seasons. Those are the elite programs. Those are your top 4. Those are your teams where every year over the previous 3 seasons, they have been in the national title conversation consistently. And again, Penn State, Oregon, Washington, adding in the 4 former Pac-12 teams, and Penn State, they have a ceiling that they need to break through, but they have the potential to break through. It's unlikely with James Franklin, but you never know. Those 3 are at minimum great programs who are competitive as well. And Oregon is competing for national champions. And Washington just competed for a national championship last year. Finally, I want to say that Ryan Day, for all the criticism that he gets, for whether it's having a losing record in playoff games or against top 10 teams, Kirby Smart is 2-4 in the SEC championship game. Now he has a winning bowl record, a winning playoff record. He's won 2 national titles. And Day hasn't had any of those things. But in year 5 for Kirby Smart, at the end of year 5, he didn't have a winning record in the college football playoff. He hadn't won a national championship. And he actually had a worse record, both in conference and overall, compared to Ryan Day. When you play in tough conferences that have depth and also at least one program that is at your level, you are not going to own that conference year after year after year. The Tressel years and the Urban Meyer years are impossible to replicate in a conference that actually has depth and multiple national title contenders, which the Big Ten has now. What I'm essentially trying to say is that Tressel and Meyer spoiled Ohio State. They did. And that's also the Big Ten's fault, because there was no one who consistently could compete with those 2 teams. I mean, Michigan, Penn State, Michigan State, you name any team in the Tressel era, they were not nearly as consistent as Ohio State was, even over the course of 2 to 3 years. It's the same thing in the 2010s, outside of maybe Mark D'Antonio from 13 to 15. And those teams did not have the talent or the offenses, or even in some case with 13, because the BCS was still around and not the 14 playoff, the opportunity to compete for a national championship. And Michigan State fell apart after that 3-year run. Ohio State just kept on going. Now, Michigan, could they fall apart this coming season? Since they don't recruit in the top 10, they lost a bunch of their staff, and they return only 40% of their production. Well, there's a chance. But I wouldn't say it's as large of a chance as Michigan teams before Harbaugh came in, or Michigan State teams under D'Antonio. They have too much talent, and they were very well coached. And because their strength and conditioning, you can assume that their backups and third stringers are ready to take steps forward. You look at Oregon. Oregon's a team that coming into the Big Ten, last year they beat Washington once, especially in the Pac-12 championship game. They're in the playoffs too. And maybe they're playing Michigan in the title game instead of Washington. Who knows? Or maybe they play Michigan in the Rose Bowl. See, there's so many, not just hypotheticals in recent memory or factors that you have to take in, analytics, but look at the present, look in the future. Winning the Big Ten or beating an elite team every year won't happen. Day doesn't have to win a national title every other season or even every 3 seasons. That would be expecting him to be Nick Saban. What he has to do is win a national title at some point. He has to prove that he's not John Cooper 2.0 and he can never beat Michigan unless there's just a massive disparity in performance. And he has to continue to maintain the program and make tweaks to it to improve it that he inherited. And while he's not the best of the best, he has improved an elite program. As I stated earlier, Ryan Day's teams on an average basis are better than Urban Meyer teams. He's just playing in a tougher conference. More specifically, his biggest rival is bigger and better than ever before than any edition of that rival in Michigan that Urban Meyer ever faced. But finally, what about the 2024 season? Ohio State has the highest percent of bets and money on winning it all. And I think this results from their large amount of returning stars and also raw talent. Factoring in the staff changes, the returning stars, raw talent, and the portal class, I hypothesize that Ohio State will be run heavy. They return more on the O-line in bringing back 4 out of 5 starters, bringing in a transfer, and adding in Quinshawn Judkins. Meanwhile, they lose Julian Fleming. They lose Marvin Harrison Jr. They lose Kyle McCord. And they brought in a quarterback who's better at running than McCord was, but perhaps, not guaranteed, but could be worse in passing. Ohio State will likely be run heavy on offense, or at least more run heavy than any year under Ohio State post-COVID. The defense, with how much they return and the portal additions they made, most notably Caleb Downs, their defense will be as good as last year's unit, possibly superior. Statistically, I think it'll be worse because they're playing a much tougher schedule, but in terms of efficiency, and when you watch them play, they'll be better at stopping the run, they'll be even more locked down in defending the pass. The question is linebacker, which is a big question, but with the talent there and Cody Simon as an anchor, I think that unit will be great. His defense is going to be one of the best, and I would say, given the depth and what they return, most likely is going to be the best defense in America. The Buckeyes are second in SP+, fourth in FPI, and second in my rankings. But they can be number 1 if they answer some of the questions that they have yet to answer. And I think if strength and conditioning can improve and Day prioritizes winning a title, I believe that this team will win it all. That's all I have to say in this video. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Brasco Rascal for being Heisman Patreon members. Thanks to Chris Lane and Connor Little OH for being All-American Patreon members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being All-Conference Patreon members. I hope you all have a phenomenal day. Visit my Patreon page and my merchandise store via the links in the description and pinned comment. And I hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye.